what's up? Welcome to week 3 of the S Word. We are going to talk about a controversial saying of Paul today that we find in 1 Corinthians. The reason why it's controversial, Aldrico will actually get into, but what Paul basically is saying is it's better to be single. And if you're single and you read that verse, I know I've thought it, I'm sure you've thought it, Paul, you're crazy. I don't think it's better to be single. You must not know what it's like to have a girlfriend. So Aldrico, break this down for us a little bit.
So it does sound crazy. In the beginning, in Genesis, God decides that it's not good for man to be alone.
Right.
So then later in the New Testament, here comes Paul and he's saying, no, it's better that you never marry, to be as I am. If it doesn't make sense. So it's in the Bible, so there must be some wisdom to this. So what I would want to challenge us today in is to see Paul's words as an opportunity for a greater perspective and an avenue for deeper devotion in ways that we don't know now as single people, and we want to challenge all of us to get there. So I'm going to break down 1 Corinthians 7 verses 6 through 35. I'll give you a second to flip there. So starting in verse 6, he says, "Now as a concession, not as a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I am myself, but each has his own gift from God, one of a kind and one of another." So let's back it up. Paul says this is not a command, but rather a concession. So
What does that even mean?
Yes.
Concession, command, break that down for me a little bit.
So the original text is actually written in Greek. So the word concession in Greek basically means an acknowledgement or a bestowing of a privilege to choose.
Okay.
Yes. So what Paul is saying, you have the opportunity to choose singleness or marriage once that gift is offered to you.
Got it. So he's not commanding you must be single or you must be married.
Right.
It's this choice.
Right.
Okay.
It is a choice from God. God is not saying, hey, be just like Paul, never get married. God has plans for both marriage and singleness. And again, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Yeah. So one of the even more controversial verses from this chapter is verse 9, which we all know. "But if they cannot exercise self-control, then they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion."
Burn with passion.
All right, Brooke. So I think that's a little self-explanatory as to what it means to burn with passion is to have a desire. But what Paul continues to say on is that if one has the ability, and this is a challenge, if one has the ability to keep themselves from sexual immorality, to stay celibate, even lacks the desire to be married, his concession to us is to remain that way. That's a pretty heavy statement, because if you have the opportunity to choose not to do that, to continue to not do that, does that mean isolation or being alone?
So it's kind of like this moment where you ask yourself, I feel like, should I be single? Like almost, does that make sense? Like I feel like in culture, especially, we have, since we were little, always thought, one day I'm going to have a spouse, one day, like that's kind of, but I think in some ways what Paul's saying is, hey, evaluate yourself real quick. If you can refrain, maybe this is a gift. Maybe you should consider. Is that what Paul's kind of saying to us?
I 100% agree. I think that where Paul is about to take us, as we're about to see in verses 29 through 35, is that marriage is going to produce a different kind of fruit than what the fruit of singleness will give. So that's what we want to dig into today. First, I want to just make it very, very clear that there's no comparison between the two. I feel like that's where we kind of get lost in singleness. And one of those things that we want to dismantle culture-wise through this class is that marriage is not better than singleness, and singleness is not better than marriage. Yes,
marriage is not better than singleness, and singleness is not better than marriage. And that's a huge thing, because I think we have to be honest with ourselves of thinking like, yeah, sure, I believe that. But if that is not the core of what you truly believe, I think our goal would be try to get to that core, and let's try to dig up and figure out why you don't believe that.
Yeah, I think it's worth asking the question, why do I even want to get married?
Yeah.
Is it to keep yourself from loneliness? Is it sexual satisfaction? Is it so that somebody else can meet your needs? The truth is, marriage is going to be the most sacrificial thing that you will ever do. Although we're not married, we've been around enough married people to know that you lay down your life for someone else once you come into that commitment, which is where Paul takes us in verses 32 through 35.
So do you have like the perspective of a married person? Like, is that you want to hit on that a little bit?
That is what he's about to say. So this is challenging to hear. So I'm just going to read through this really quickly. It starts in verse 32. "I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about how to please the Lord, but the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman, the unmarried woman, the single girl, is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and in spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and secure your undivided devotion to the Lord.
That's good. That last line even, not to lay any restraint upon you. Like, that's good.
Yes, and I think that's even something to dissect. Paul, again, is coming back, hey, I am not commanding you to do anything, but this is a concession to consider how your devotion will change in singleness and in marriage. But I think a part of that is the choice between the two. Even before the opportunity of marriage comes, what are we going to choose now in our singleness? So to sum that all up, the unmarried person has a very singular focus if we choose that, and that is to please God. Whereas the married person has a very broad focus where he says worldly things. And that's not to dishonor marriage. That's not to say that marriage isn't great, because marriage is in fact beautiful. And again, I always want to repeat it for the millionth time. We do desire that. We do want to be married. We are not bashing it in any way. But to be married means that your focus is on worldly things. And that doesn't mean like they're like off sinning and doing crazy stuff, but that does mean like you have to take care of a home. You have to take care of children. You have to take care of the light bill, the water bill, the cleaning, thinking about someone else, thinking about your husband, your wife, whereas single people.
Right. So, I mean, Paul's kind of ending it that where he's talking about there is going to be these divided interests, right?
Yes. So being married means that he says it in one of the verses that your interests are in fact divided as a married person. So backing up last week in week 2, I mentioned being discipled in every season of your life. We want to repeat that again. Be discipled in every season of your life, regardless of what is happening. And for me, in my singleness, I have had this beautiful privilege and just blessing of being intentionally discipled in intentional relationships with a variety of married couples. So I have Priscilla and her husband who've been married for about 10 years. Yes, amazing. Jillian and Eric who've been married for about 7 years. Love them a lot. Don't have children. So Priscilla and her husband can have 3 kids. Priscilla and her husband, Jillian and Eric don't have children yet. I live with the Ulriches, Matt and Tracy, who have 2 beautiful girls, and also the Kardecks, who are an older couple who've been married for 30 plus years and has a daughter who is like 21 years old, and I love a lot. So I have had the blessing to be around them, and all of them say the exact same thing. Married for different seasons of life, married for different years, have a different amount of children, no kids, multiple children, and they will all say marriage is the most beautiful commitment, but also the most difficult. Again, not to put down marriage, but again, you now have to sacrifice someone for someone in ways that you just didn't have before. So
it makes me feel like it would have almost been wrong for Paul to not warn us in some ways. Does that make sense? Like I think, because I think some of it too is really counting the cost of marriage. Because when we think about marriage culturally, I think we're thinking, oh, love, romance, you're going to complete me. And I think Paul's even like kind of giving us a perspective, exactly what you said, of have you counted the cost of marriage? Like if you need to think about that before you go in, because marriage is not selfish, it's very selfless. And I don't know, I'm listening to you say this and these things are just clicking, like Paul was doing us a favor. It would have been wrong for Paul to not say, hey, like let me just give you this perspective.
Right. You know, even you're saying this is kind of going off script, but you just said that like how this is marriage is asking us to count the cost. It's in the same way of like the marriage and the covenant to Christ.
Yes.
Being single, the analogy for single people to understand is like the singleness is almost like being worldly, doing your own thing, not really following the Lord. You can choose whatever path that you want and be focused on whatever thing that you want, versus when you come into covenant with Christ, because of the love, because of the benefits, because of all the good things that you get, you now choose to lay down your life and sacrifice. Because of the love that's pursued you, you pursue in return. So that's also my point. One of my next points is that marriage is a foreign concept to us. Like,
we don't know it.
we have nothing to compare it to. Maybe if you've been dating and you've been in a serious relationship before, you've been sacrificial for your spouse, or if it's not for your spouse, but for your girlfriend or for your boyfriend. But the reality is that we know nothing of that gift.
So it's true when you think about it. We have everything we think of marriage, we paint the best picture. Because it's all the things you want, it's all the things you desire. I can't wait to have this. And it's kind of hard to think through. And I've said this before, and it took a lot of time with the Lord to get to this point, but it was like, I know marriage is going to be hard, but I am ready for that, because I do feel like in some ways it's going to bring me closer to the Lord. Like being excited for that challenge. I'm a challenger anyway, so I'm like excited for the challenge. But it is a good perspective to have too, of like, this is what I want to go into. But in the end, no matter how much we hear it or we haven't experienced it.
Right. We don't know what it's like until we're in it and then we're committed.
Right.
And this is not to, again, I want to repeat, not to bash anybody, but there are a lot of friends that we have that got married really young and they're like, this is refining me in ways that nothing else could have because there was no other experience like this one before. So this is, I think, the one of the strongest points about this. I'm going to back up a little bit and go to verse 17. Be in your season. So brothers, in whatever condition each was called, let him remain there with God. Whatever season you're in, whatever condition that you are in, be there with God. So if you decide that dating and marriage is to come and that's on the horizon, be there with God. But if you're single right now, be here with God. Like, I also think one of the biggest pieces of advice I've gotten from all those married people that I just named, even my own parents, is don't waste your season of life. Don't waste this. Don't be wishing that you were somewhere else. Like, that's in everything. That is where you work. That is how you do school. That's the place, the city that you live in. Don't waste the season, the beauty and the blessing of where you are now, wishing that you were somewhere else. Paul is literally saying that whatever condition you are in, be there with God. If you are in this with the Lord, then you are going to find the contentment. And when marriage comes, you have plenty of time to worry about marriage. Don't be in singleness worried about being married, because you're now wasting this opportunity of what's in front of you right now, which is what we're pushing is an undivided devotion to the Lord.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we talked about in the first week that marriage, it's not actually a setback, but it's actually an opportunity. It's a gift that we have. And I love what you're hitting on, because that's what I'm going to be talking about more next week when we meet. We're going to be talking through what can we do now with this opportunity that we have.
So like we said, and as Paul said, this is by all means not mandatory, but there's wisdom in this. So like she said, she's going to talk about the practicality of how to be single and how to use the best parts of this gift. But I have homework for you guys this week. So something that we have you doing these devotionals and fill in the blank with different things, but there is something very practical that I want you to do this week before we get back to week 4. But I want you to find at least 2. So it can be your parents, it can be anybody, married Christian couples, and ask them what has changed in their life from being single to being married. So share and ask them to share their views of singleness with you. Ask them what changed. Ask them what advice and tips they would give you. And even in that, I would challenge you to see how what they have they're saying, what we're saying, how that compares to what you are currently thinking about this season of singleness. How does this compare to what Scripture and what Paul is saying about singleness? Does anything change in you? Is there anything that's like, this is hard, I don't believe this? Or do you even agree with all this and you're rolling with us into week 4 and unscathed and you are doing really great and you're content in your singleness? But yeah, challenge yourself to talk to somebody, to hear from married couples about what the difference in life is.
That's good. I'm super excited to talk to you guys next week as we're going to get into the practicalities of this, because I don't think this is talked about enough. I think we hear some things, but we're going to get really practical, give you tools of what you could do, how you could steward that singleness. So super excited that you're with us tonight, and we love you guys a lot. Don't forget to jump into Zoom groups. Those are coming up. So you could click the link below and that'll bring you into a discussion group where we could talk further into all the things that we talked about tonight.
All right. Well, we love you guys. We'll see you soon.